Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I rise to speak on Senate Bill 1596, the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act. Before I do that, though, Mr. President, I want to say a few words about a terrible event that occurred this morning in Pennsylvania. The students at Franklin Regional High School in Murraysville, Pennsylvania, suffered a terrible, devastating tragedy this morning. A person, and this person is believed to be a fellow student, took out a knife and attacked his fellow students before the start of the school day. It appears as many as 20 people were injured, some severely. Our thanks go out to the first responders who did respond as rapidly as they could. And our prayers go out to those who were injured and their families at Franklin Regional High School. Mr. President, I want to turn to this bill that I've introduced, the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act. It's Senate Bill 1596. I want to thank my co-sponsors, Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Mitch McConnell. And I will tell you the inspiration for this bill begins with the story of a boy named Jeremy Bell. The story begins in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. One of the school teachers in this school that Jeremy Bell attended, that Jeremy Bell hadn't attended, but one of the school teachers in the school in Delaware County was found to have molested several boys and raped one of them. Prosecutors decided there was not enough evidence to bring a case. The school knew about what was happening and decided to dismiss the teacher for this appalling behavior. But what was so amazing and disturbing about it is the school also helped this predator land a job at another school in West Virginia, even passing along a letter of recommendation so that they could move their problem somewhere else. The story ended in 1997 when that teacher, by then a school principal, raped and murdered 12-year-old Jeremy Bell in West Virginia. Now, justice finally caught up with that teacher. He's now serving in jail a life sentence for that murder. But for Jeremy Bell, the justice came way too late. Jeremy Bell's father wouldn't rest until he knew he had done all that he could to help try to ensure that no child or parent would ever experience a similar tragedy. Roy Bell, Jeremy's father, worked with Congress to create protections for children to ensure that they were not victimized at school. I think it was some consolation for him and for his loss. The U.S. House of Representatives responded to this terrible, terrible tragedy. On October 22nd of last year, the House unanimously passed the Protecting Students Against Sexual and Violent Predators Act. But again, sadly, justice came too late. Jeremy Bell's father passed away just 3 days before the vote. So now here we are in the Senate with the chance to pass the same bill, the bill that has already passed the House unanimously. It's a bipartisan bill. It's the bill that I introduced. It is the companion legislation. And as I mentioned, we have bipartisan support for this bill. But I hear some people suggesting that maybe we should wait. Maybe now is not the right time. Maybe we need more time. Mr. President, I just want to say as strongly as I can, we've had enough waiting. We've wasted enough time. And let me explain why we can't wait another day. I want to start with two numbers. The first is 130. Since January 1st of this year, Mr. President, 130 teachers have been arrested across America for sexual misconduct with children. That's more than one teacher arrested for each day of the year so far. And that's, of course, only those who've been caught and arrested. Every moment we delay rooting out some of these problems. The other number is 73. 73 is the number that comes from the Government Accountability Office. GAO says that the average pedophile molests 73 children over the course of that pedophile's lifetime. These predators actively seek out the environment where they can find victims. That's what they do. And what better place for them than schools? And so they go from school district to school district, sometimes from state to state, methodically looking for victims. Every moment we delay, we let a predator move on to the next of his 73 victims. So the damage that these predators do is just enormous. It's damage far beyond what any number can convey. You know, the past few months, I have had a chance to visit a number of child advocacy centers around Pennsylvania, meeting with the men and women who work with abused children, whether it's helping them through the criminal justice system or whether it's just helping them to start the healing process. And these folks do some incredibly important and very, very good work. But again, you can't visit one of these centers without being profoundly impacted by how devastating the abuse is. And I can't come up with the words to convey how devastating it is, but I can let some of the children speak for themselves. And so, Mr. President, I'm going to quote from two children, students, who were victims. Shannon of Nevada was raped by a teacher. The teacher was later convicted of sexual assault and sentenced to life in prison. 9 years later, here's what Shannon wrote, and I quote, "When I was a senior in high school, Mr. Peterson approached me and said I would need to go to night school if I wanted enough credits to graduate on time." And of course, he taught one of those courses, a computer class. "I was 17, and he raped me 4 times over the course of a year. He said he would fail me if I ever told. He also hit me and made threats against me and my family. So I didn't tell. I held it in for a year and a half. In the end, 66 people offered to testify against Peterson. His first victim dated back to the year I was born. Some of those who spoke up were parents. Their daughters had complained at the time, but nothing was done. And that made me very angry. It still does. I learned that a handful of teachers and 2 principals knew about him, and his teaching license had been revoked in Michigan years before, but no one knew why. I'm different because of what happened. I have to watch people all the time, analyze them. I can't be carefree. Now I have a 7-year-old son and 2 daughters, ages 3 and 1. I will homeschool my girls." It's a case of a boy from South Carolina named Gary. He's one of at least 29 boys abused by a teacher, Mr. Fisher, over the teacher's 37-year career. The teacher is serving 20 years in prison. 2 school principals were sued for allegedly covering up the abuse. What Gary wrote is as follows. "I was 9 when it started. The abuse was frequent and long-term till I went to college. I knew there were others too, but until it all came out, I never knew how many. You feel so guilty, so ashamed. It's frightening now to look back and see how calculating Fisher was. I did everything I could to get kicked out of school. I was in the guidance counselor's office all the time. Finally, in 10th grade, I got myself kicked out for cheating. By the time I went to college, I was drinking all the time. I was terrified to quit because then I'd have to feel. But I couldn't drink and do school, so I entered rehab. I was 18. It took me a year and a half, and I've been sober since. My life is good now, for the first time. You can survive it, but you have to deal with it." He goes on to say, "I always felt that what the school did was far worse than what Fisher did. Fisher was a sick and evil monster, but the school just calculated the damage to its public relations. We kids were disposable, which is a whole other category of evil." So, Mr. President, the question before us is what are we going to do about this? What can we do? What are we going to do? My bill, the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act, it's a sensible first step in protecting these kids. It would require a mandatory background check for existing and prospective employees, and the checks would have to be periodically repeated. There are 5 states today that don't require any background check at all. Second thing that my bill would do, it would check all employees or contractors who have unsupervised contact with children, not just teachers. So coaches, school bus drivers, anybody who has contact with kids, in my view, should undergo this background check. There are 12 states in which there is no such requirement on contractors. My bill would also require a more thorough background check. It would require a check of 4 major databases, both state and federal. In Pennsylvania, for instance, if an employee has been living in the state for 2 years or more, there is no federal background check done at all, only the state, and I don't think that's adequate. The way these predators move from state to state, I think it requires that we check the federal database. Importantly, Mr. President, my bill would also ban what we call passing the trash. This is that horrendous practice whereby a school discovers that they have a predator and they intentionally ease the predator out and sometimes actually facilitate that predator getting a job somewhere else. That should be illegal, and my bill would make it illegal. The fifth thing that my legislation does, it would stipulate that schools cannot hire a person who's ever been convicted of any violent or sexual crime against a child. I think that's a very reasonable first step. In addition, it would ban hiring of a number of specific felonies, not all felonies, but felonies such as homicide, child abuse or neglect, crimes against a child, including pornography, spouse abuse, rape or sexual assault, and kidnapping. Any of those felonies are obviously so egregious that I think they would qualify a person to be excluded from working with children. In addition, anyone convicted of a felony physical assault or battery or a felony drug-related offense would be prohibited for 5 years. Couldn't be hired for a 5-year period. The enforcement of all this, Mr. President, would be that if a state refused to adopt these very common sense measures to protect kids, then they would get no federal funding from the EASA. I think the states would adopt these reforms. I would point out there's nothing the least bit radical about these proposals. In addition to having passed the House of Representatives unanimously, we in the Senate just passed a virtually identical background check requirement on the Child Care Development Block Grant legislation that we adopted, I think it was last week or the week before, very, very recently. That bill had essentially identical background check provisions for daycare workers. That is very sensible. That's an important, good step. It makes sense to protect children in a daycare, but it makes no sense whatsoever to protect the kids at a daycare and then leave them defenseless when they move on to an ordinary school. Finally, again, let me emphasize, Mr. President, this bill has broad bipartisan support manifested in the House and here in the Senate. But more than that, I think it's a moral imperative. Our children deserve to be protected now. If that's not a responsibility that we have, I don't know what is. The protection didn't come soon enough for Jeremy Bell or for Shannon or for Gary, but we don't have to fail other children by delaying this. So I would suggest right now, Mr. President, I would ask any of my colleagues who object to this legislation, who have any concerns about this, I would welcome understanding how or why legislation that passed unanimously in the House, legislation that is completely consistent with what we passed just a couple of weeks ago. Why that should be a problem, I can't imagine, but I would welcome hearing any objections if there are. But I want to see a very speedy passage of this legislation, Mr. President, and so it's my intention tomorrow to come down here to the Senate floor and ask for unanimous consent of my colleagues that we pass this legislation here on the Senate floor. That will expedite this process, and that will assure that we put this really important safeguard in place as soon as we possibly can. Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I have one other issue I want to address briefly before I yield the floor, and that is I want to speak a little bit about the Exim Bank, because we